The next speaker is a member of the B2O core group, who, if Arnie DeBover is not here, has really pushed that website into prominence and existence. It's Professor David Golumbia. He's in the English department at VCU, where he is associated with the PhD program in, what is it, Media Arts Text?
Media and Text.
Text, MATX, yes. David studied at Oberlin, which is interestingly a place from which many graduates have come here to do PhDs in the recent past. But he skipped over us and he went to Philadelphia and did his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2016, he published The Politics of Bitcoin, Software as Right-Wing Extremism, a book which is small in size, but which is substantively important for the present configuration of national politics and culture, and I strongly urge it upon everyone. In 2009, he published a book called The Cultural Logic of Computation from Harvard. As I said a moment ago, for several years he's been the vice chair of B2O, the online journal, where he's worked with Arnie DeBover and the other members of that group. I believe Henrik Vigen is somewhere here, who's a key member of that group as well. He's had special responsibility there for the online magazine Digital Studies, which I recommend to everyone. And in 2018, edited for B2O a special issue entitled The Digital Turn. And there will be more such work appearing soon. In 2013, he published The Future of New Media. Also in 2013, a, to me, very informative essay on high-frequency trading, networks of wealth and the concentration of power. In Diacritics, recently a paper, The Science of Language and the Language of Science. There's that chiasmus again. And in 2016, another, I think, very important paper for grasping the current formulations of the moment on the topic correlationism, in quotation marks, correlationism, the dogma that never was. David assures me that had the internet not been invented, he would have grown up to be a full-fledged philologist, but that he's been distracted by political obligation from the freedom of inquiry into language and thought. And so today he has a chance to go back to his roots, as they say in some parts of this country, and, or roots, as they say, at the eastern end of the state where I happen to be from. His title today is The Deconstruction of Philology. So join me in welcoming David Golumbia, please.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for that, as you just said, the opportunity to speak about a subject that, were it up to me, is probably what I would have spent my career working on. Maybe not philology exactly, but as may come out from this talk a little bit, I have been able to publish a few works about this over the years. I hope to someday do some more, but what happens when you look at the diversity of world languages and hold it up to what philosophy of language in particular is trying to do? Because I think there is a deeper clash there than is evident on the surface. And that's sort of how I got to this work, which maybe will become apparent toward the end. Okay, the deconstruction of philology. This has 5 parts. Each part is on a relatively discrete subject, though they will come together at the end a little bit. Part 1. In what remains the most sophisticated and detailed analysis of the history of philology thus far, in my opinion at least, Roots, Races, and the Return to Philology. I was conscious of Paul saying roots. I'm going to talk about roots a lot here. Jeffrey Galt Harpham describes both the multifaceted nature of philology in practice and its profoundly ambivalent legacy. Philology was never just the precursor to what we now call linguistics and to certain varieties of textual criticism. It was from the outset a highly complex and interrelated field of study that in some guises aspired to, quoting Harpham, conjoin a limited empiricism to a speculative practice with no limits at all. When it discovered the route that led from the close study of the text to the language of the text, and from there to the author, the culture the author inhabited, other cultures, the origins of cultures, and finally to human origins and the mysteries surrounding these origins. Philology did not just encompass these extra-linguistic fields. They formed the core of a practice that informed a great deal of the evolutionary and biological and even geological sciences that were developing at the same time. It helped to develop and at the same time to combat the emerging doctrine we today know as scientific racism. Though philology, especially in its grander aspirations, is today regarded as something of a failed enterprise, Harpum argues that this can obscure its profound and ongoing influence on contemporary thought, both inside and outside the academy. Confining himself largely to literary and to a lesser extent linguistic scholarship, Harpum identifies three areas in which the thought we see in philology continues to influence us. First, the concept of origin, according to which things are explained when their origins have been identified. Second, a characteristic duality, a double commitment to an empirical attention to linguistic fact and a more subjective approach to questions of context, meaning, and value. And third, the assumption that scholarly inquiry into the historical or formal dimensions of the language of the text can illuminate issues of personal and collective identity. This last assumption ties into the complex history of philology as race science. And here Harpum recommends that we must learn to, quote, discriminate between the right and wrong kinds of returns to philology. The right kind of return, he submits, would begin with an act of disciplinary soul-searching that holds up the history of philology as a cautionary reminder that the focused professional attention we apply to the object can make us susceptible to ambush by received ideas passing as common sense or even as empirical observations. Said and Daman, he writes, of the two most famous exhortations in recent scholarship to return to philology, quoting here again, might have considered this possibility before promoting a practice that had been intimately entangled with racist and anti-Semitic theories and practices. In this, they were promoting the wrong kind of return, one that sought to use philology as a means of restoring a lost sense of groundedness, assurance, and professional self-esteem. This bifurcation or ambivalence runs especially deep in philology, deeper than Harpum describes, largely because his essay is constrained to questions of language and text. In fact, the work of philology is profoundly with us today, especially in popular discourses on race and heredity that it both absorbed and significantly elaborated when it did not create them outright. At the same time, philologists were among the first and most ardent proponents of the view that all human beings are profoundly equal, and that attempts to categorize peoples and histories according to greater or lesser stages of development or civilization were deeply misguided. As Harpum and the historian Stephen Alter note, these sentiments were at times recommended by the very scholars whose work was relied on to transmit the opposing racist message. That the scholars themselves did not always robustly advocate for their more emancipatory perspectives is not the only explanation for this. In one of the modes he most frequently deployed, Derrida said that deconstructions happen. I take this to mean, among other things, that major foundations of philosophical and cultural thought both collapse and reconstruct themselves in ways that are highly complex and often ambivalent. In its early phases, philology is itself a site of such deconstructions, perhaps some of the major ones in the Western tradition, and for this reason it's no accident that Nietzsche started out as a philologist. Philology upended any number of existing discourses, especially ones about language, cultural identity, cultural development, and biology. Among the ideas that emerged almost unrecognizable from the philological deconstructions were the great chain of being, the idea that languages were eternal objects handed down from God, that what we roughly call species were similarly discrete and eternal, and that cultures could be analyzed in terms of the languages they spoke in a profoundly discriminatory way. To be sure, many of the new versions of these ideas looked not all that different from the older ones after the work of philology. That possibility is inherent to all deconstructions. Yet at the same time, some of the ideas that are among the most powerful we have to reject those ways of thinking are also found in philology. Perhaps a better way of saying this is that the deconstruction of philology continues even today, and that by seeing that work more clearly, we may be able to root out some of philology's more poisonous legacies and to reinforce and develop its more emancipatory ones. Part 2. The philologist in whom these tensions and contradictions can be seen especially clearly is one of its best-known architects and one of its earliest practitioners, the Prussian polymath Wilhelm von Humboldt. Humboldt's legacy is poorly understood in the English-speaking world, not least because much of his corpus remains untranslated. It is also poorly understood due to the ways later thinkers, maybe especially Noam Chomsky, have deployed certain limited aspects of Humboldt's work. Humboldt's legacy is by no means one to celebrate uncritically today. Some parts of his work are worthy of celebration. Others need to be heavily criticized, and other powerful strains in his work that seem unfinished, or there are other powerful strains that seem unfinished or that might be pushed further in our own moment. Others help us to see how this very act of thinking about the topics that cluster under the heading of philology continue to constitute much contemporary understanding of central topics like race and ethnicity. The deep ambivalence in Humboldt's project is especially evident in his attitude toward the diversity of world languages. Humboldt was one of the first writers in the West to put forward the idea that all languages are in some important sense equal, and that they all contain phenomena of deep scholarly interest and relevance to the understanding of what language itself might be. An idea that, insofar as it was offered at all, tended before Humboldt to be at best regional in scope. That is, some colonists and missionaries in their own areas learned local languages and considered them equivalent with the European tongues they spoke themselves. But this was rarely spun into a philosophical political insight that European languages were not in general inherently superior to others. Humboldt himself does not undo this hierarchy. He too thinks some languages, especially but not only European ones, are more developed in a cultural sense than others. But he is clearly fascinated with both the diversity and unity of languages in a way few thinkers were before him. And his discriminations among civilizational types is far richer and less dogmatic than those of many other thinkers. It is no surprise that he considers Greek and Latin language and culture to be especially advanced, but there is a tone to his work considering other languages that is relatively new in the Western canon. We do not find in Humboldt the sweeping condemnations of non-Western cultures, nor even the hard and fast racial categories that we do in Kant, perhaps especially notable since Humboldt follows rather directly in Kant's intellectual line and spent a fair amount of time in his earlier years studying Kant and with students of Kant. Some sense of the ambivalence in Humboldt's project can be seen by looking at the ways he treated languages that appeared and still appear especially distant from those of his contemporary Europeans. In one of the final chapters of his major work, Linguistic Diversity and Intellectual Development, called Less Developed Linguistic Structure, the Semitic and Delaware Indian Languages, Humboldt relies on linguistic data gathered by the North American philologist Pierre Duponceau to reflect on the grammatical plan for languages that Duponceau was the first to call polysynthesis and its associated phenomenon of incorporation. In languages with polysynthesis, words seem to be able to swallow others, creating highly complex compound forms that do the work done by entire sentences in other languages. This phenomenon is known in the US via the caricature seen in, best known at least, via the caricature seen in media representations of Native Americans, where Native names are often given as English phrases or partial phrases, such as, maybe most famously, dances with wolves. Humboldt notes that polysynthesis entails reducing many words to very brief sounds or clitic forms, so that small segments of what are entire words in one context can be glued into others for purposes of polysynthesis. This is a radicalization of the processes of suffixing, prefixing, and case marking found in many languages. This principle of grammatical organization, found for the most part in the native languages of the Americas and Australia, had long baffled all but the most sympathetic observers like Duponceau. Humboldt notes that what he calls this word mutilation has been very strongly criticized as a barbaric crudity, unquote. And here's more from him. However, he writes, a deeper knowledge of the Delaware tongue and its word relationships would be necessary to decide whether in these abbreviated words the stem syllables are destroyed or preserved. Despite the relatively ambiguous tone of this statement, Humboldt argues that word meanings are in fact preserved. And he notes that similar incorporative processes are found in many other world languages, if in less dramatic form. In languages like Delaware, he writes, there is a noticeable inclination to present to the intellect in a package the ideas combined in the concept instead of individually, and at the same time to associate them phonemically. He calls this picturesque, reflecting an evidently figurative treatment of concepts. This rewriting of the understanding of linguistic development and its cultural politics is a deconstruction, but that does not mean it is a complete eradication of the racial categories and hierarchies that philology was both pulling down and reconstructing. Humboldt goes on to assert that reason requires of the word that it call up the concept completely and purely defined, but at the same time it indicates the logical relationships in which it appears. The Delaware language satisfies these rational requirements in its own way, but does not meet the demands of the more elevated linguistic sense. Conversely, this language becomes the living symbol of imaginative power, connecting images serially, and in this respect it preserves a very peculiar beauty. This clearly remains a statement of European superiority, but it is notably couched in very different terms from what had come before, at least with regard to languages. It's familiar from discourses like Rousseau and so forth. This is by no means to exonerate Humboldt, but instead to view intellectual history as in part a series of deconstructions in which contact with empirical facts, coupled with a somewhat open mind, has dissolved some of the more problematic features of the ideology of European superiority. Humboldt's overall attitude toward the way that civilizational development relates to linguistic form is itself more nuanced than we might expect. One source for this nuance is Humboldt's profound respect for the individual as well as the collective achievements of society, something that is reflected as well in the political liberalism that characterized Humboldt's brief political career. While he certainly does think that some languages are more advanced than others, he does not seem to consider more advanced societies to be very far ahead of those less so. And in fact, his attempts to give substance to these ideas of advancement and elevated linguistic sense are fairly limited. To the contrary, Humboldt repeatedly emphasizes that though a language may influence and even constrain our particular creative and intellectual capabilities, individuals are always capable of escaping these constraints. In fact, it would not be wrong to argue that Humboldt sees that escape as one of the essential features of language itself. Part 3. The deconstructions of philology remain unfinished in our typically surface-level answers to the deeply philosophical question of what language is, a question that haunts Heidegger and Derrida, as well as much contemporary analytic philosophy and linguistics. In 2016, the philosopher Charles Taylor published one of the most original and striking works on the theory of language to have been published in decades, a book that takes on the question of the nature of language directly, called The Language Animal, the Full Shape of the Human Linguistic Capacity. While the book's arguments flow somewhat naturally from Taylor's earlier essays on philosophy of language, it goes a significant distance beyond them. Taylor essentially rereads the whole of European American philosophy since at least Descartes and Hobbes, showing that despite their differences, these philosophers share assumptions that both linguists and philosophers continue to subscribe to until today. As Taylor shows, these assumptions are arguments, not metaphysical certainties, and once they are opened up to question, as only a thinker with Taylor's experience and learning can do, we begin to see glimmers of a conception of language very different from the ones handed down to us by both philosophers and linguists, including figures central to the history of language and philology like Humboldt himself. In fact, Humboldt's work is key to Taylor's argument. The theory of language he calls designative, clearly the dominant view of language nearly everywhere today, he associates with Hobbes, Locke, and Condillac. The view he puts forward, which he names constitutive, emerges from a much smaller group of authors, all of them German philologists of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Hamann, Herder, and Humboldt himself. One of the ways to get at Taylor's argument is to think about the object of linguistic and philological study. These disciplines, in their narrowest forms at least, study, very simply, human language. This seems straightforward, but Taylor argues that it isn't. The unacknowledged leap in reasoning is one that goes from human language to human languages, plural. If we want to understand language, this leap implies, we must understand how English or Latin or Navajo or Dirabal works. Now, there is no denying that this is true in many ways. In fact, in keeping with philologists like Humboldt, attention to these empirical details is essential, and this is part of philology's characteristic doubleness that remains of real value. But Taylor questions whether something very fundamental has been missed in the slippage from human language to human languages. At a very basic level, nearly everyone agrees that having language is something unique to humans. That doesn't mean that animals don't partake of the many aspects of language, but we all, at least all philosophers and linguists, from Chomsky and his followers to at least the majority of the most ardent anti-Chomskyians, think there is something to be explained in the human capacity for language that is only explicable by examining what humans do. Taylor wants us to think carefully about the last word in that phrase, do. What do humans do with language? Here we are already in the realm of that somewhat mysterious species demarcation that all linguists and philosophers puzzle over. Humans use language to do things like planning, speculating, naming, and describing. These activities are nearly impossible to imagine without language being part of them. With language, we create new meanings. We describe new realities and synthesize thought into forms it had not taken before. The designative view, likely familiar to most of us, says that language must be seen as a way of packaging information, of assembling sentences and well-formed clauses so as to produce true and false judgment about a world that is already there. To be sure, Taylor does not dispute the fact that these functions exist and are often extremely important, for example, in scientific practice. What he argues is that when we focus exclusively on designative functions, we risk missing what language is always doing, even while it is being designative. Possessing a language, he writes, is to be continuously involved in trying to extend its powers of articulation. In other words, we always sense that there are things we cannot properly say, but would like to express. New articulated descriptions allow the world to impinge on us, to move us in new ways. That is why we call them constitutive. Unlike designative views, which tend to focus on language as a capability of the individual, on which Chomskyan linguistics is notably focused, the constitutive view takes as irreducible the social functions of language. In their constitutive form, these are activities that even the most generous portrayals of animal language seem to rule out. Critically, for Taylor's view, these activities exist independent of the features of particular languages. That is to say that regardless of which language a person speaks, we can say with a high degree of confidence that they use their language to engage in the activities I've just named, and that indeed it is difficult to imagine how they could do these things without language. One of the most striking things about Taylor's approach is that it provides a different means of accessing the universalist impulse in linguistics from the ones we find among scholars who adhere to the designative account, albeit one shorn of much of the ideological framing we associate with universalist projects. Humboldt himself advanced a complex of somewhat vague concept he called the prototypal element in language, by which he seems to have meant to refer to the constitutive functions that Taylor elaborates. And here's a somewhat lengthy quote from a recent synthetic work on Humboldt. Humboldt thought that the investigation of individual languages and their specific form and character should be guided by the linguist's awareness of the prototypal element in them, while his work should also contribute to our knowledge of the prototype. The task of the linguist was therefore to study each language as a fragment of the universal language of the human species. Yet for Humboldt, languages do not differ from each other as species, but as individuals. Their character does not pertain to the species, but to them as individuals, as conditioned by and as a result of their own specific historical development. The comparative study of the world's languages, as Humboldt envisioned it, thus represented a constant challenge to the empirical linguist and to the philosopher, namely to discover in the linguistic data that which relates to the prototypal in language and to increase our knowledge of the nature of language and the human language capacity. This passage helps to demonstrate the characteristic doubleness that Harpham and others value in the work of philology, that the constitutive functions of language can be obscured if we get distracted by the fascinating details of their designative properties. This fact can be used to spur on additional empirical research rather than shunting it aside in favor of theoretical abstractions. Part 4. It is now treated almost exclusively as a curiosity that philology once named a study so general that it could be posited something like a science of all sciences. The best known example of that is found in Charles Darwin's explicit deployment of inverted trees, what we now call phylogenetic trees, to model evolution by natural selection, a model that he and other evolutionary theorists took directly from philology. Everything in this model proceeds from a set of profoundly crude metaphors. Single nodes branch into two child nodes below the parent, clearly and discreetly. This model hangs on with profound cultural force, even when empirical research repeatedly produces examples that don't quite fit the metaphor or don't fit it at all. Another aspect of this blending of what we now see as the sciences and the humanities in philological practice emerges in the 19th century adumbrations and extensions of the concept of race. And it seems no accident that the set of concepts we now call scientific racism, whose first articulations are found in Immanuel Kant among others, just at the beginning of the enterprise that jointly promulgated theories of the descent of man and the descent of languages. As Harpham, among others, have pointed out, these moments are profoundly ambiguous. Even as William Jones is positing a profound historical connection between European and Indian languages, and thus suggesting somewhat forcefully that the two peoples are more alike than different, sprung from some common source, as he famously said of European and Indian languages. Philological concepts of linguistic descent were conjoined to those of racial descent. And while figures like Humboldt seem at least most of the time to be arguing that all languages are equal at a deep level, ideas of ascent and descent lurk everywhere at the edges when they are not explicitly adopted, as they were by some of the more infamous philologists like Renan. We tend to think today that these ideas are safely tucked away in the past, but it seems to me that this is deeply mistaken and worryingly so. In much of the popular imagination, genetics and race operate in just the way that the tree model seems to suggest, and for that matter, languages often do as well. They merge like individuals and produce offspring, and many even insist that those offspring are some kind of advance over their progenitors. Yet one does not need to read very far into the newest forms of scientific racism to see exactly these ideas surfacing on a regular basis. To far many in the world today, evolution just means this branching off of discrete children from discrete parents. And that descent is almost always portrayed as development or innovation. English comes later than old languages like Greek and Latin and Arabic, to say nothing of Aboriginal languages, and is therefore better or more advanced than those others are. English is also an intact species-like object, easily distinguished from those other languages, much as chimpanzees are distinct from baboons, which is actually a higher level distinction than species. Similarly, the races too are discrete nodes in a tree of descent, with whiteness as the most recent innovation and the most obviously developed of all. In the designative view of languages, trees are used to describe grammatical structure as well, and of course they form the heart of at least the early versions of Chomsky's theories. These ideas are so powerfully written into our culture that it can be next to impossible to uncover just how many of them today's most advanced promulgators of racial discrimination subscribe to. Yet marks of that old philology are evident if we look for them. The popularity of genetic testing services like 23andMe reveal a deep and misguided belief on the part of many in our world that race is something that can be found in our genes, despite the overwhelming number of geneticists who reject this view. The 23andMe's genetic analyses do no more or less than point at places where other people with similar genetic profiles may have lived in the past, regardless of whatever we might call their race, is one of the facts that the contemporary racist seems unable to process. Although I consider such genetic data collection projects to be profoundly ethically offensive for reasons outside the scope of this argument, it remains the case that the data these tests produce tend to show rather conclusively that race does not exist at a genetic level. Yet the profound hold of the philological idea of racial descent holds us so powerfully today that even evidence of its falsity is taken as evidence that it is true. The popular idea of DNA and genetics has many sources, and it would be wrong to ignore the role played by fundamentalist religious ideas in it. But it is also the case that what is taken to be Darwin's scientific findings about the tree-like descent of species and the discrete nodal character of species remains a cornerstone. These ideas drawn from philology have proven in many ways to be more powerful than the scientific research that has vindicated the theory of evolution. Because scientists understand that it is wrong and have adopted approaches to genetics and evolution that constitute deconstruction upon deconstruction of these earlier scientific theories, they and we ignore the extent to which the older ideas retain a profound hold on the cultural imaginary. So part of the job of the deconstruction of philology has to be the recognition that in fundamental ways, from language to genetics, philology never went away at all, and that we have only begun to understand how deeply rooted our political culture is in models that too many of us think we discarded centuries ago. Perhaps surprisingly, we have many examples of what a philology that has undergone or experienced more deconstruction might look like, at least in linguistics. One of the clearest places to see this is in just the tree model that Deleuze and Guattari famously challenged in Intellectual History in the Rhizomes chapter of A Thousand Plateaus, using Chomsky as their example, in this case his tree model for grammatical structure. To Humboldt and other philologists, the tree served as a model for how languages themselves develop in history. The whole idea of Indo-European, the positing of which remains one of philology's apparent triumphs, is the clearest articulation of this idea, according to which some common source sits at the apex of the tree, and daughter or child languages emerge as the terminal points. Proto-Indo-European is the apex or trunk, and modern French and German and Hindi are their children. And I should note that it's very interesting if you search in the alt-right or just world fascists right now, and their real interest in Proto-Indo-European, which is a posited language that there's no record of. Linguists have posited it, and they are all over this thing, right? They think that this is the language that the white people spoke. Recent historical linguists have started to raise serious questions about how accurate the tree model is. After all, languages have very permeable boundaries. Unlike organisms, we don't even have a rough and ready sense of what counts as the inside and the outside of a given language. The linguist who examined the tree model and its consequences most closely is the British-born Australian linguist R.N.W. Dixon, who, despite his public obscurity, rivals Chomsky for influence inside the world of linguistics today. And if I had time, I would also talk about, I'm going to talk about historical linguistics, but I would also talk about alternative models in linguistics of grammatical structure that push back against the tree model. And if I had time to do a presentation, I would show you what these anti-trees look like. They are incredibly complex and interesting, and they don't look like trees, especially with these like dominance hierarchies, and I don't have time for that. Through his work with the languages of several Aboriginal groups, including the Dirbal of North Queensland, Dixon developed a methodology for linguistics to which, historical linguistics, to which empirical evidence is central and theoretical reflection follows from it. When I got out into the field in Australia, he writes, I found that I actually understood very little about how language is structured. But I learned little by undertaking analysis of text, attempting grammatical generalizations, and checking these with speakers. As straightforward as it sounds, this is in no way the task of linguistics as it has become understood in the wake of Chomsky. As Dixon remarks in the same passage, there is a tradition of not doing fieldwork among many modern-day linguists. The tradition of fieldwork, which philologists like Humboldt had done much to encourage, had been robust in English-speaking linguistics before Chomsky, even during Bloomfield's generation, the one before Chomsky. Chomsky did not set out to dismantle it, yet it is very much the effect that the Chomskyan revolution in linguistics has had, especially in its first decades. However, in part as an effort to counter Chomsky's universalizations with empirical counter-evidence, along with other reasons, typologists like Dixon began to look with new eyes at the linguistic data that had been gathered. What Dixon found, especially in Australia, gradually emerged as evidence for the way in which the tree model has significantly deformed the project of linguistics. The problem is that the family tree model was developed for and is eminently appropriate to, at least he says this at the time, the Indo-European language family. It has become the received view of how languages are related, so that linguists attempt to discover an Indo-European-like family tree structure in every group of languages from anywhere in the world, whatever their typological profile. While for some groups of languages the family tree model is entirely applicable, Dixon somewhat unsurprisingly turns to a more recent scientific model, the revision to the tree model and natural selection, roughly articulated by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge under the name punctuated equilibrium, to paint a picture according to which language areas, like species environments, tend to exist in equilibria until punctuated by environmental changes. During equilibrium periods, linguistic features tend to diffuse across the languages of a given area so that over a very long period, they converge on a common prototype. Then during a period of punctuation, characterized by expansion and split and familiar events like war and colonization, a series of new languages will develop, diverging from a common proto-language. And it is generally only during a period of punctuation that the family tree model applies. Although in recent work, Dixon and his colleagues have raised questions about the extent of the model's applicability even there. Among the problems with the tree model is that over most of human history, there has been an equilibrium situation, while the last 2,000 years, and especially the last few hundred, have been the scene of a spectacular punctuation, such as is unlikely ever to have occurred before. Instead of, or in addition to the tree model for language change, Dixon develops a model he calls areal diffusion, one that has been far more common over the 100,000 years of human linguistic history than have trees. The areal diffusion idea is fairly straightforward. If two languages are in contact, some of the speakers of each having a degree of competence in the other, they are likely to borrow lexemes, grammatical categories and techniques, and some grammatical forms, and gradually become more similar. In large areas like Australia, New Guinea, the Amazon basin, the Americas prior to colonization, and sub-Saharan Africa, areal diffusion was the norm. This means, among other things, that our strong sense that languages are separate, nameable things that can be cleanly demarcated from each other is mistaken. To some extent, this applies even in areas where the tree model works, as you know, if you go near the French and German border, right, where the languages, you're not even sure which of those languages you're speaking if you had to name it. One of Dixon's main targets is the genetic method in historical linguistics, the practice of inferring details about language change and language origins by looking at current language practices. This is the heart of the deconstruction that I argue is taking place in Dixon's work. Linguists assume, but many others assume as well, that languages follow the rough pattern of biological evolution, with generations following in fairly regular temporality, with words as the primary means of exchange. This idea of language is particularly interesting because it is one many non-linguists take for granted. They don't just do this at the margins. Scientific journals like Science and Nature regularly publish papers by physicists, statisticians, and other data scientists that take word lists and the rate of change as givens, presume languages are discrete objects, and try to work backwards to ultimate proto-languages that provide some kind of foundation for human history itself. This kind of search is remarkably resistant to facts, let alone to the kinds of theoretical observation offered by Dixon, despite the fact that he shows rather conclusively that linguistic features change and merge at altogether unpredictable rates. This language science holds on tenaciously despite significant contrary evidence is itself part of the work of philology, a part that we could well do without. It is also not just about language. It is about race, ethnicity, and culture. The fact that physicists are interested in language enough to conduct experiments about it, while arrogant enough not to consider linguistic scholarship enough of a field actually to read into it, suggests a politics at stake. And if you want to see more of that politics, read the exchanges between linguists and the physicists who do this work, they are just remarkable. Because the physicists are deeply committed to what appears to be a racial idea, right? And they cannot see that, right? They cannot be made to see that, even when the linguists are simply arguing you don't have your linguistic data right. The politics is one that is deeply invested in the search for origins, and one that, following the tree model, continues to endorse a model of evolution according to which human cultures exist on a scale where some are more civilized and others less so, and where there exists a real, if submerged, desire to place language groups on something like the great chain of being. Philology itself is one of the main sources for this developmentalist view, and Humboldt is one of its chief progenitors. Some of Humboldt's most profound work in the categorization of languages, according to the dominant type of grammatical construction found in them, a categorization that obviously derives inspiration from Kant, where two types are named analytic and synthetic, while the other two are agglutinative and the polysynthetic form discussed earlier. Humboldt did think some cultures were more civilized and more creative than others, and he did think that languages developed into others through a genetic process. Yet he also made clear that he did not believe that this process was entirely determinative, that language determines thought, or that individuals were bound by the languages they speak into those developmental stages. It's part 5, somewhat shorter. One of the recent outgrowths of the philological project is the heightened attention globally to language loss, to which linguists refer as endangered language, or languages, or language endangerment. It is impossible to look at the work jointly undertaken by linguists and speakers of indigenous and minority languages, work that has only truly begun in earnest since the 1990s, and not see yet another deconstruction taking place. Not only are languages outside of the majority not faulty, barbaric, or undeveloped, but they are in fact practices to be valued, studied, saved, and reflected upon. Yet in this cause, there is still some of the ambivalence that has characterized the philological project and all its ancestors and descendants. In both linguistics and in the communities that speak so-called endangered languages, we find versions of the same claim. These languages must be saved because, as Dixon himself puts it, quote, "a language is the emblem of its speakers. Each language determines a unique way of viewing the world. It encapsulates the laws and traditions and beliefs of its ethnic group." I want to hold on to that last statement a little bit more than the others, which I'm about to criticize. Similarly, in one of the many papers by indigenous speakers given in recent years to similar effect, Ethel B. Gardner, a member of the Stolo Coast Salish First Nations people in Vancouver and a speaker of Stolo Halkomelem Salish, which was one of the world's really fascinating language families, quotes a mission statement that the community adopted in 1988. "Without our language, we will cease to exist as a unique people." It is hard not to be sympathetic with messages like this, but it seems to me that they threaten to lead down a road that the history of philology already shows us as politically troubling. While framed as a positive message about ethnicity, the converse message, that without their languages, tribes and peoples are no longer themselves, is one that seems hard to endorse. There are native and indigenous people, to say nothing of the many people who are members of groups that recently spoke metropolitan minority languages like Celtic languages and Yiddish, whose membership in their various ethnicities would not seem to be dependent on the language they speak. What it is dependent on is an interesting question. And I was thinking of the Elizabeth Warren thing as I was finishing this up, because you saw a lot of these claims going in all different directions. And Yet, what the positive claim, that what we wanted to say that ethnicity consists in, was much harder to put a finger on. And when people did, I thought it was troubling. The idea that languages contain a spiritual essence of the people who speak them, an essence that is ineffable unless one speaks the language, seems itself disturbingly right on the edge of an essentialism that can become nationalism. One of the small threads in the work of philology, especially in Humboldt, offers a way through this dilemma, at least possibly. In Linguistic Diversity and Intellectual Development, Humboldt repeatedly offers sentiments like this one, quote, "Inasmuch as languages are inseparably interlaced with the innermost nature of man, and far more automatically abrupt from it than they are arbitrarily engendered by it, the intellectual peculiarity of peoples could equally well be termed its effect. The truth is that both emerge simultaneously and in reciprocal coincidence from unfathomable depths of the mind. That is, as much as we can say that language contributes much to the way we see the world, the individual is always able to reassemble and make new connections and elaborations that are not determined by their language, or in Derrida's terms, deconstruct, right? Indeed, this is the essence of the constitutive view of language that Taylor urges us to recognize and expand on. Language builds us, and we build it in profoundly reciprocal manner. Humboldt tends to use words like style and aesthetics to characterize language at points like this in his argument, and this strikes me as a useful way forward. Rather than thinking of them as essential expressions of national identity, languages can be understood as something more like works of art, possessing aesthetic and stylistic aspects that, like literary works, are important to us precisely because of their uniqueness and their similarity, the way that they are about the world we inhabit and build it at the same time necessary when tensions arise in the established global accounts. We experience these frequently today because of large-scale religious and ethical changes. For instance, earlier global accounts in which a moral code was seen as immediately given in the text of the Bible have been shaken and discredited for many people while remaining strong for others. This notion of language as the working out of fresh interpretations and meanings, it seems to me, provides an interesting thread that runs from Humboldt and Taylor and includes Derrida. The immediately given nature of the moral code in the text of the Bible gives way to success